Why was all this science ever allowed? Why was it ever let begin? Science is an enemy of everything that's natural in life.
And exploit all these giant possibilities of science that have been squandered hitherto upon war and senseless competition.
Is it any better world than it used to be? I rebel against this progress. What has this progress, this world civilization done for us? Machines.
Welcome to EIR Talks. This is Tony Pappert. It's Wednesday, April 7th, 1999, and with us in the studio is New Federalist Editor-in-Chief Nancy Spannaus. The subject of today's broadcast is things to come. We have wars girdling the globe today. In the Middle East, we've been fighting an undeclared war against Iraq for most of the past 9 years. In Africa, there are countless wars, or many wars, the largest probably being a war taking place in the Republic of Congo, where, among other things, the armies of 5 to 6 neighboring countries are engaged in an effort either to preserve or overthrow the government of Congo President Kabila. Neighboring Angola is in deepening civil war, as it has been for most of the past decade. In South America, Colombia is at war within its own borders. Again, a deepening war which has been going on for years. Now, with the unleashing of a new Balkans war by our sorry Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Vice President Al Gore, we have a new Iraq-style war in the very heart of Europe, neighboring 5 other European countries. Now, for the characters of these wars, and this will be a subject throughout our show, look at this undeclared war against Iraq. As we sit here today, U.S. and British planes are taking off virtually daily for apparently aimless bombing runs on Iraq, hitting such targets as oil pumping stations and other targets of opportunity. The more serious for the Iraqis, there has been an embargo on Iraq for the entirety of the past 9 years, which has doomed its growing young generation to malnutrition and doomed a substantial proportion of them to lifelong stunting and mental underdevelopment because of the effects of malnutrition in childhood. And these were people who hadn't yet been born when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, which is supposedly somehow the reason for the whole exercise. Now we're repeating a similar exercise in the Balkans. This is not war in the classic sense of Clausewitz or the American Revolutionary War or the American Civil War. It's not war in the sense that the government mobilizes the citizenry on behalf of a clear moral purpose. There is no other resort. Every other resort has been cut off. The citizenry mobilizes itself for a great moral effort, for a moral, winnable objective, and goes to war as we did in World War II. This is not that kind. These are not that kind of war at all. This is war where there's no definite meaning of victory. They're wars which go on indefinitely. Nobody can say when they're going to end. And they're wars which, and you'll see this increasingly, they're wars which involve, on the one hand, ultra-modern Tomahawk missiles, other kinds of ultra-modern so-called intelligent weaponry, and on the other hand, they involve a rock to the skull, a stick to the back of the head, and not just modern armies fighting, but neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother. So we have the world covered by these kinds of wars, if you could look at it this way from outer space. They're not all small wars by any means. They're not yet as big as World War II or World War I. But if these wars unite themselves in one general conflagration, it will be a kind of World War III which we've not seen on this planet since the 17th century. A war of all against all with no end. Now, Nancy, you've been studying the British New Dark Ages faction of the 19th and 20th century. Is there a plan behind all these wars and warfare?
It's quite eerie, Tony, when you go back and you look at the grouping that were the publicists for the British imperialists at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And you look particularly at people like in the Fabian Society, people in the Coefficients Club like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, Lord Bertrand Russell. And you see that they had a plan for reorganizing the world that would permit permanent control by their class, by Bertrand Russell's class. Wells was a commoner, but that would allow them to control through mind control, through drugs, through culture, the entire power over the universe. And they wrote about it quite openly. They said there was a faction around Ruskin in the late 19th century that openly said we want to go back to a new dark age. But these characters ostensibly wanted human progress, and they talked about human progress, but they actually wrote, and more than wrote, propagandized and manipulated a whole layer of culture and popular entertainment and drugs and all sorts of other artifacts which have shaped our culture today to create a kind of situation that we're facing now at the end of the 20th century. Lyndon LaRouche has often said in the last few years that you can't understand the shift that the United States in particular has gone through since the Kennedy assassination without understanding H.G. Wells. He wrote an article at the end of 1997 called The Wells of Doom, which is something that I looked at just recently again, and it's absolutely eerie that the ideas that were being written in 1896, 1913, 1933 are the ideas that people think they come up with by themselves. They think that they are for denying technology to the third world because something happened. It's not because of that. It's because these ideas were put into circulation. They've been surrounded by them in culture over this period.
Who really was H.G. Wells? I mean, most of our readers, listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with his name.
He was I think he was a middle-class Briton who made a name for himself writing science fiction novels in the 1890s. One of them people in the United States became very familiar with in the late 1930s, called War of the Worlds, when it was broadcast on radio and people thought we were being invaded from Mars. He wrote quite grisly science fiction movies, and but then was picked up in a more serious way in the early part of the 20th century and began to write more what you would call scenarios. What we're going to look at today, this movie Things to Come, which Wells was involved personally in producing in 1933, came from a book that he wrote called Shape of Things to Come, which he did in earlier in the 30s, and was an attempt to rationally lay out how a one-world government would come into being. It flopped. I mean, one thing that Wells did is he made his money by writing, so he would write these long things that would be serialized and he would make money. But so in this case it was very long and it didn't work. So he did this, hooked up with a fellow here in the United States called Alex Korda, and fortunately the movie, which was shown in the late 1930s, it was done in 1936, is in the public domain, so we are able to actually take a look at sections of it, and people can begin to get the idea of what was set into motion here. Now, a couple other things about Wells. Those who do know him, conspiracy buffs and so forth, will know him as the man who wrote a whole one-world government manifesto in the early part of the century.
The Open Conspiracy. Open
Conspiracy, yes. And this is soup to nuts. It's eliminate sovereign governments, population control, and all the way down the line. The second thing he did that is less well known, I believe, is in 1913 he wrote a monograph saying, well, mankind is developing a new technology. It's nuclear technology. We can foresee a time when we can bring mankind under control with limited nuclear wars. And in fact, this concept, where he was tied into the leading edge of British science at the time and was aware of the fact that nuclear energy was being developed, was something that was evolved into what people today would know as Dr. Strangelove in the movie of the 1960s, was it? Yes. The man who was the model for Dr. Strangelove, Dr. Leo Szilard, was actually a protege of H.G. Wells, and he didn't come up with this idea on his own. And the idea, if people are not familiar, is literally what's being discussed in strategic circles today. That if this process of endless war, which you were discussing, gets to the point where it's the United States against the other nuclear superpower, which is Russia still, then we could make a deal. And the deal could be, well, we knock off one of your cities with nuclear weapons, and you knock off one of ours, and say 50 million people die, but that it will blow off steam, and we'll have a modus vivendi, and we'll be able to proceed. Now, I'm not saying that it would happen that way, and this is a utopian concept that the British Empire has. But you get the idea of the maniacal willingness to see a devastation of human life and civilization that these characters have, in hopes of being able to maintain control after the catastrophe has actually happened. Not that that would happen, in fact. LaRouche has often pointed out in the recent period, too, they're really, and as we can see by the demise of the United Nations in some respects, this idea of having a one-world government which can contain any kind of conflict is really passé. You're either going to have a total degeneration into barbarism, or you're going to have the kind of proposals of sovereign nation cooperation that Lyndon LaRouche has put forward in his new Bretton Woods proposals, and which call for the alliance of China, Russia, and the United States, bringing in other sovereign nations to actually begin to rebuild the world. So the only way you can really understand this war process is to understand that it's being orchestrated, not fingertip control, but in broad control of the strategic thinking of policymakers and your strategic thinking by a British-American Commonwealth faction, the inheritors of H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell's ideas. Now, I want to review, and we'll show a few clips of the Things to Come movie, because I think it will underscore the point we're making, with people having to recall that this was done in 1933. It was prior to the Second World War. And obviously, people in Britain were aware that they were headed toward a war with Germany, but this had not yet happened. And none of our modern civilization. This does not feature nuclear war, but it does feature other aspects of what we actually see going on right now. So the movie opens in 1940, at which point, right before bombs begin to fall on a place called Everytown, which is clearly London. And what is, there's a little debate between the characters who were there, and they say, well, is this war going to be good for us? The way many stupid Americans and others say today, well, gee, a war would be good, we can get our industry started again. Or the British say, when they want to get their enemies fighting, let's have a splendid little war in the colonies. But so one side is that, the other side says, well, this may not be the same this time. This time, when we have war, is there a concept of victory, as you were saying? What will happen? And what proceeds over the next good 15 minutes or so of the movie is a process, you see a process of endless war. And the war in the movie goes on from 1940 to 1965, years verging in to 1970, and civilization itself is wiped out. What you see is just constantly, tanks, planes, gas warfare, which of course had been done in World War I and was very well known to people, and ultimately the elimination of the ability to even fix anything that was destroyed. So now to get a sense of where this, and at the conclusion, their disease breaks out of a sort that is clearly meant to be reminiscent of the plague of the the initial Dark Ages, wiping out 1/2 of the population of the planet. And we have a clip here that will give the viewers a sense of how Wells portrays that.
Mary, iodine.
There's no more left, Father. This is the last drop.
God. What is the use of trying to save this mad world from its punishment?
Oh, Father, if only you could get some sleep.
How can I sleep? See how they wander out to die.
Just shoot them. It's their lives or ours. Let's get guards and make a court.
That's how they dealt with the pestilence in the Dark Ages.
So we see there the sickness taking over, the plague, they called it the wandering sickness, the total elimination of the modern capability of dealing with this by science, and a return of barbarism in the world. In fact, you could say that's precisely, what that reminds me of is Iraq, as you said, where the bombing campaign has in fact eliminated the most advanced medical capability that existed in the Middle East, so that no longer, and in Russia, where in many places of Russia it's no longer possible. So having done this, created this horror scene that H.G. Wells does, he then moves to set up what might be the solution. At first what appears is groupings of primitive national tribes, in effect, organized around bosses who are trying to reset up civilization. And this guy's called the boss, and he's taken over, and he's trying to mobilize the technology and get his country back together again. When suddenly, out of the blue, come the high technology alternative to this. And from here, this is the hero of so-called the film, is a fellow by the name of Cabal, spelled as you would expect. And Cabal represents the challenge of the one world order against these people scraping to survive as national governments. And if you want to think of this next scene that we see as NATO versus Milosevic, I don't think he would have a very big stretch. So let's take a look at the essence of what Wells is trying to get across as the phony alternatives before us in this strategic period.
This is an independent sovereign state at war. I know nothing about any old order. I'm the chief here, and I'm not taking any orders, old or new, from you.
I suppose I've walked into trouble.
Yeah, you can take that as right.
Where have you come from?
I flew from our headquarters in Basra this morning.
We have some hundreds of new type planes, and we're building more, fast. The factories are working again. We're gradually restoring order and trade in the whole Mediterranean area. We're scouting this region now to see how things are.
You found out. This is an independent, sovereign state.
Yes, we must talk about that.
We don't discuss it.
We don't approve of independent, sovereign states.
You don't approve.
We mean to stop them.
That's war.
If you will.
Now, in fact, you may not see that in the press from day to day, but that is the concept behind the British-American Commonwealth grouping. Right. There is no sovereign nation state. That is what, in the broad sense, that President Clinton right now is blinded from seeing. Right. Why these forces and their lackeys like Gore and Albright are calling, and Blair, who's one of the most prominent, are calling for war against Yugoslavia. It's not against Yugoslavia, it's against the concept of the sovereign nation state and any protection against such a world government domination, which will control all the technology, which will decide who gets technology and who does not get technology. Now, we want to show just the last section of this, which again poses it very, very sharply, because getting out of the war situation per se, what happens in the movie is, of course, these guys take over, who control the high technology planes. They eliminate the nation state, and they build modern cities and presumably set mankind free from barbarism and set him up for progress. But this is, in the book, it's clear that this is really done with very tight genetic controls. People are reshaped, the deformed people, the sick people are eliminated. The population of the world maintains itself at 2 billion people over the course of centuries because of this kind of culling. But what you see in the movie is an attempt to win the minds of a certain elite to this idea of control of technology in a demented anti-human form. So what we're going to see is a splice, is two parts from the movie put together, which I think best show what this fellow cabal is really trying to put across for the audience.
That's what endless warfare has led to, brigandage. What else could happen? But we, who are all that are left of the old engineers and mechanics, have pledged ourselves to salvage the world. We have the airways, all that's left of them. We have the seas. And we have ideas in common. The brotherhood of efficiency. The Freemasonry of science. There they go. That faint gleam of light. I feel that what we've done is monstrous. What they've done is magnificent. Will they come back? Yes, and go again and again, till the landing is made and the moon is conquered. This is only a beginning. But if they don't come back, my son and your daughter, what of that cabal? Then, presently, others will go. Oh, God, is there never to be any age of happiness? Is there never to be any rest? Rest enough for the individual man. Too much and too soon, and we call it death. But for man, no rest and no ending. He must go on, conquest beyond conquest. First, this little planet and its winds and waves, and then all the laws of mind and matter that restrain him. Then the planets about him, and at last, out across immensity to the stars. And when he has conquered all the deeps of space and all the mysteries of time, still he will be beginning.
We're such little creatures. Poor humanity is so fragile, so weak. Little animals.
Little animals. And if we're no more than animals, we must snatch each little scrap of happiness and live and suffer and pass, mattering no more than all the other animals do or have done. It is this or that. All the universe or nothingness. Which shall it be, husband?
Now, I hope our readers were not so taken in by that, our viewers not so taken in by that as to think that they should choose between those two. The contrary to some of what the words say, the demented idea of a Freemasonry of science, which is going to control and determine what happens to every individual on Earth, in contrast to man as a human being with a creative intellect made in the image of God, working through the nation state, is dramatic. And yet, today, I would bet that many so-called educated people would tend to fall for choosing, are we a worm or are we a Superman, which is precisely what is presented here. So, but the demonic nature of this vision is what people have to begin to understand in the mentality of the oligarchy, in the mentality of the British American Commonwealth grouping. And that's what's behind this drive for war, which is effectively a drive to try to prevent any alliance between the United States, the premier nation state in this planet, and Russia and China. It's a destructive drive, and, pure destruction, not with some grand vision of how we're going to help mankind. Right. So this is what Lyndon LaRouche has been stressing a great deal lately. Yes, we need a war to eliminate this kind of thinking and this kind of control over particularly President Clinton. What happened, as it's been said on this show many times, is that over the course of the impeachment assault, President Clinton was weakened. His powers of judgment have been impaired, right. And he's been relying on a crew brought in by Gore in 1996, 1997, which is been tutored in this kind of approach to the world. Gore right. is the quintessential technological apartheid. We control technology for your good kind of person, right? Which does translate into genocide, and that's what we're fighting when we're fighting this process of pushing forward toward war.
Right. Now, Madeleine Albright has been a very prominent figure in bringing the United States into this Balkan War. She engineered a fundamental change in the Rambouillet negotiations last year. She tossed out the elected leader of the Albanians of Kosovo, or ethnic Albanians of Kosovo, Ibrahim Rugova. She replaced him by a terrorist organization, the KLA. And since then, it's been all downhill in the negotiations. That led to the shoving of the Russians out of the negotiations, to achieving, contrary to the whole setup, to achieving an agreement which was rejected in advance by the Russians for NATO military power in Bosnia. And from there on, it was an inevitable catapult into the war in which we find ourselves now. I know you've been reviewing EIR's file on Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is the teacher of Madeleine Albright. And when we return, I'd like you to tell us how the thinking and career of Brzezinski relates to this mad adventure we've now engaged in the Balkans, if it does.
It certainly does. Woody Woodpecker's at it again, and he's knocking at the foundations of civilization, I'm afraid.
You're watching EIR Talks. We'll be right back. Welcome back to EIR Talks. This is Tony Papert. It's Wednesday, April 7th, 1999. With us is Nancy Spannaus, the editor of New Federalist newspaper. Before the break, I had asked Nancy about the role of Zbigniew Brzezinski in landing us in this terrible blunder of a Balkans war, because Brzezinski's leading student, our unfortunate Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, was instrumental in changing the Rambouillet peace negotiations into a process that inevitably led to war. And Nancy has been reviewing EIR's file on Mad Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor.
Yes, last time we saw Brzezinski, I think people will think of him in the last days of the Carter administration, when he was ecstatic about the launching of war in Afghanistan, one also of the most devastating long-term no-win wars. And this was part of something he picked up from a British geopolitician, as he picks up most of his things, called the arc of crisis around the Soviet Union. And it was just a horrible way of trying to deal with the world situation. Of course, the Soviet Union was quite different from Russia today. They did have a world domination plan, but Brzezinski, having been tutored by William Yandell Elliott and a whole series of British geopoliticians, was approaching this from the standpoint of not any common national interests between peoples and nations in the world, but to try to inflame and create wars in the whole circle around the Soviet Union and play off China against Russia and essentially create a situation where the British geopoliticians would continue to dominate through raw materials, financial flows, and prevent any kind of world peace. Now, Brzezinski, I don't know exactly what he's been doing in the last since 1980.
Very prominent in the media at this moment.
But recently, he's made a big comeback. 1997 was really the beginning, I believe, when he wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard. There's a long subhead, too, something about geopolitical something. And this book was first actually picked up in Russia because of its highly provocative nature, because he picked up effectively where he had left off in 1980. But now, going after the Russian Republic and saying that we now have the opportunity in the United States to dominate the world. With the one sole superpower, we can dominate Eurasia, which is the whole area from Europe all the way through China, and we can do this. We just have to make sure that Russia does not have an alliance with China. We have to make sure Russia does not have undue influence, he says, in Central Europe, which have been the natural economic partners of Russia, particularly Germany. And then we also, he says, to do this, really make it easier for the Russians, he suggests that they break themselves up into three areas: Eastern Russia, Central Asia, and Far Asia. And then there's a lot of discussion in this book. All of these guys always have their hand in the till at the same time, discussing with oil companies, raw materials, cartels, and others of how they can loot Russia, particularly in the Central Asia region. So in 1997, after he wrote this, the Russians, who already were quite alarmed at the impact of the IMF conditionalities on their country and saw behind that an attempt to destroy them as a nation, and were afraid that was from the United States as opposed to Britain, which it's actually from, said once again, you know, aha, here we are. You know, America's out to destroy us. Brzezinski's up front, and there were very sharp retorts. Now, since this time, Brzezinski has effectively been beating the drums for this. And you have to realize that this was written about a year after Madeleine Albright came into power in the State Department. I don't know direct connections between Gore and Brzezinski, but I strongly suspect that there are some, because Brzezinski, when we looked into him back in the 1970s, and we discovered, was also a technotronic freak. This guy puts together his geopolitical machinations with a belief that we have to have mind control through computers, and we didn't have the internet then, but if we had, I'm sure he would have included that, in order to supposedly get world peace. What this is reminiscent of is, again, the movie. One thing that I forgot to mention, not only the Freemasonry of Science, but also this idea of, well, how do you get peace? In their idea, and we didn't think to go through this, the pacification of the boss happens through the dropping of a peace gas, not any kind of rational coming to the idea of common interest, but a psychedelic experience. And in fact, this is the kind of thing that Brzezinski wrote about in his Technotronic Era book, which was written very closely in association with NATO back in the late 1960s. So this is what is behind and what is going on here. And when the Russians therefore respond to NATO's action in Yugoslavia by saying this isn't really about what they say it's about, this is about destroying Russia, they can point to chapter and verse effectively to show this is the case.
Right, right. So by declaring Russia the enemy, he's in effect making Russia into an enemy of the United States, or intending to do so, and vice versa.
And he then goes on TV and says, you know, no problem, ground troops, we can whip the Yugoslav army, don't worry about it, they're demoralized. Speaking as the great Eastern European expert, right, when in fact he's been a long-term emigre from Poland. I don't think they want to claim him at all. And he's talking strictly from British geopolitics.
And like these others, I mean, frankly, he knows how to start a war, but he's not concerned with how to end one once it's started. So the responsible people are most responsible out front are Tony Blair for the British Empire, Madeleine Albright, whose role we discussed, very instrumental in bringing this war about, and Al Gore, who we discussed on previous shows. I mean, what is Gore's responsibility, as you see it, for this current war in the Balkans?
Well, I think we'd have to look at that in two ways. One is what we went through last week on the show, which was his specific role in preventing Primakov from coming to the United States and finally having a meeting with President Clinton, right, and to be able to try to come to a modus vivendi, because if you wanted to stop genocide in the Balkans, you had to have a meeting between, right, the effective head of state in Russia and Clinton, the President of the United States. So you had a possibility under those circumstances, right, which otherwise was really not very clear. But in the longer term, Gore, as a representative of this kind of thinking of the British American Commonwealth grouping, with this kind of world vision that he has actually promoted in Iraq. Gore has been one of the, right, leading promoters of this technological apartheid against Iraq, has been the key person in the administration who's been promoting the destruction of Russia through the IMF, has been promoting anti-Primakov forces, particularly within the last 6 to 8 months, right, through his alliance with Chernomyrdin, and has been doing everything possible to prevent the kind of alliance between, an FDR-style alliance between the United States and Russia, to reverse the decline in relations and to reverse the economic decline. Gore's out to protect his godfathers, and, right, his godfathers, like George Soros, are totally tied into the speculative bubble, the raw materials control, and the outlook for the continuation of a British empire by other means, right, which is what is being pursued here in this war onslaught. Now, EIR for years has called Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian dictator, a Hitler, and has decried his ethnic cleansing, and has previously, of course, strongly supported the Clinton administration's moves to support the Croatians and the Bosnians against Serbia, which led to the Dayton Agreement. I mean, how can EIR and you and Lyndon LaRouche now oppose NATO action against Serbia, which is supposed to prevent genocide in Kosovo? Because it's not done to prevent genocide. It not only hasn't prevented genocide in the short term, it accelerated dramatically the genocide in the short term, but it has no intention or clear way of stopping the genocide. This is pure hypocrisy in every conceivable way, especially when it comes from Tony Blair. Right. Not that I'm saying that President Clinton wasn't potentially convinced that this was necessary, but even he has to have seen in the immediate period afterwards how what was done did not do, I mean, only accelerated the move toward the genocide. So the fact is that that this is an absolute fraud. And as LaRouche has pointed out, these people who are now weeping crocodile tears over genocide have seen it going on for years. They did absolutely nothing to stop it. It's been clear since the late 1989 that, in effect, you know, the British were supporting Milosevic and using him as a tool and promoting the Greater Serbia ethic, which has resulted in this genocide. The British and the French in particular, and some of the Dutch, were extremely strong in allowing him to continue this process before. And now, you know, when it serves the purpose of destroying the United States in particular, they all of a sudden are out front saying the genocide is the most important thing, even though what they're doing is actually doing nothing to stop the genocide. I think you pointed out just recently, the Pope also reflects this understanding. I'm sure there are many Americans who think, well, the Pope is just for peace at any price, or something like that. But this is not true. He supported the bombing in Bosnia, where there was an Bosnian army on the ground that was fighting for its survival against this genocide.
He called for it well before, and obviously not in the words "give us bombing," but he called for it and strongly supported it.
But in this case, he doesn't see a just war, because what is being done is simply a ploy which results in more genocide and which is intended to create the conflict between NATO. It's intended to promote a new NATO doctrine that eliminates sovereignty, like the Freemasonry of science, that creates a war with Russia, in effect, prevents the kind of solutions which are necessary on the ground. And you would have to ask, as Lyndon LaRouche has, if these people are so concerned about genocide, what are they saying about what's going on in Africa, where you have British Foreign Office sponsored wars, just who have already, over the course of from 1983 to now, killed an approximate 6 million people. What are they doing about Iraq, as you pointed out, where you have this whole generation of children being killed? And what are they doing about the International Monetary Fund, as in general? If you had to pick an agency which has been responsible for more genocide in the recent decades than any other force, you would have to say the International Monetary Fund. They are responsible for imposing the conditions that resulted in the breakdown of nations in the wars in Africa, that is resulting in the breakup and devastation of Indonesia, that has devastated the continent of Ibero-America. Again, like Africa, an incredibly rich continent in terms of population and raw materials and cultural resources. This is what the IMF has done. But you don't find, you know, if you were to follow their logic, you know,
they should be bombing the IMF.
They should be bombing the IMF. But of course, that's insane, right? You can see by that that's not the approach to stopping genocide. The approach is a political approach to box in these lunatics, get them out of power, and put a viable solution in effect through the kind of proposals that LaRouche has put forward.
Right. I mean, I know you've mentioned it. I know you've been personally involved in the effort to save the children of Iraq from the effects of the embargo, technological apartheid, which is, it seems to me, much more important even than the bombing campaign. I mean, can you tell us any more about this ongoing, what in my view is ongoing genocide in Iraq?
There have been some recent reports coming out of there, which we intend to be publishing by one in particular, a fellow who's on tour named, I think, Dennis Halliday, was a UN relief official who got absolutely disgusted about last August and said, you know, I can't be part of this. They say they're helping people, but in effect, we have allowed this regime to continue without any way out. And that's what the Iraqis say, and it's absolutely the case. If you go back to when the embargo was first implemented in 1990, the goalpost for what it would take to be able to get rid of the embargo has constantly changed.
Right.
And there's no way that the people who have this in effect conceive that the Iraqis could actually comply. Saddam Hussein or no Saddam Hussein. There's a very chilling interview that was given by Leon Firth, Al Gore's national security advisor, who recently had a heart attack, but I understand he's still intimately involved in discussions of strategy through secured phone lines and other things like that. Firth has been Gore's advisor on national security for, I believe, almost 20 years, and he was involved in advising Gore during the Gulf War and advising him to support it, and
right.
the follow-up policy of technological apartheid against Iraq. And what I think this was Firth, it could have been Gore, one of the interviews that was done at the time. Firth just was asked by somebody who was naive and honest, well, look, I mean, don't you need high technology if you're going to have a modern society to provide medicine and education for your people? And he said, the world doesn't need Iraqi scientists.
My God.
So, in other words, there are going to be those who are going to get technology and have a decent living standard, and there are those who will be on the dole if we decide that they're going to get any of this at all. So this is really what's happening now. The United Nations, this has not been just the British-American Commonwealth operation. The United Nations has all been complicit in this operation with this Wellesian idea. And it's been extremely unfortunate. I think the sharpest thing that was ever said about it, the regime of sanctions, came from Mahathir Mohamad, actually, in 1990, the fall of 1990. He said, I thought we gave up siege warfare.
This is the Prime Minister of Malaysia.
Yeah, Prime Minister of Malaysia, when we left the Middle Ages. But that's what this is. This is siege warfare until...
Starve them out, in other words.
And starve them out, cut off their water supply, cut off their food supply. But unlike the Middle Ages, it's until what, right?
Right.
They already signed surrender, and yet there is no relief actually in sight. So this is paradigmatic of what we can see in the entire world. And when places, therefore, like Russia and China look at the United States throwing itself whole hog under the influence of Gore and Brzezinski, and strongly under the influence of Blair,
right.
behind this policy, they are incredibly alarmed. I mean, there's been great alarm, as we've been told, in the Vatican and in the Kremlin, where you had people who thought they had a decent relationship with President Clinton, that they had an understanding of the common aspirations of their people, which they did.
Right.
And all of a sudden, it's as if there's been a body snatching of President Clinton.
Yes,
and
exactly.
He's operating instead on this technological apartheid idea. So
yes.
Iraq is a symbol in many respects, and that's what they see happening to them. If it could happen, if it can continue without end and without any idea of a just peace to Iraq, then it could happen to any country in the world if this regime is allowed to proceed.
That's what I neglected to say at the beginning. I should have said is that a just war is fought in behalf of the peace to follow the war. But the people who are launching these wars have no notion of any sort of peace to follow the war. They only know how to unleash war. And they have duped our president. And so that it seems to me, in a way, the more he violates his own inner convictions in behalf of this duping, the more violent and crazy he seems. For instance, the Pope proposed an Easter ceasefire. Clinton didn't only reject the ceasefire, but he rejected it by debating theology with the Pope, saying the proper way to celebrate the Prince of Peace is not by permitting ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. So our president has been brainwashed, and will suffer a tragic fate if this is not reversed quickly. Now, Zhu Rongji, the Prime Minister of China, is in the United States for his summit meetings with President Clinton. This potentially offers a way out, as you've been discussing, along the lines of the new Bretton Woods proposal of Lyndon LaRouche.
according to all reports that we have, Zhu Rongji's the best guy to be here. If anyone can do it, he might be able to do it. People should be aware that, as President Clinton actually said before this bombing campaign started, Zhu came here against tremendous opposition in his own country. That the campaign of effectively calling the Chinese the yellow peril, which has been picked up in this country to fever pitch over the past couple months, particularly by a whole number of these lunatic geopoliticians, Republicans in Congress, but also by a whole section of the intelligence establishment as well, has actually created a storm in China of opposition to the possibility of collaboration and strategic partnership with the United States. And there was serious discussion with Zhu as to whether he should maintain this trip, which was established, whose schedule was established months ago, and which President Clinton just over the past month, 6 weeks, had upgraded to a state visit in hopes of getting an advance in the strategic partnership and putting a lot of importance on it. Now, so Zhu has arrived, did arrive starting in, he'll be spending a lot of time outside Washington, actually, with business people and so policy layers, as well as inside Washington. He says he's here to answer questions and to forcefully put forward China's view on questions from human rights to trade and so forth. I think the first thing he did was make some trade concessions, and there's obviously a heavy effort on his part to educate people on the actual intentions of China and to break through what otherwise is, I mean, talk about brainwashing, a perception which is being created in the U.S. media that the Chinese are, number one, wanting to, and number two, capable of launching some military takeover campaign against the United States. This is one of the most lunatic ideas that anyone could conceivably have. But that is precisely what is being done. Now, Zhu will get a number of different responses here. People should realize, for example, that the essence of geopolitical thinking is to play one partner against the other. So that, therefore, when Britain, for example, lures the United States into a war, it may very well turn around 2 weeks from then and attack the United States for being ogres. Same is the case with this China-Russia situation. Brzezinski, whom we were discussing before, is all very friendly with China. He thinks that the United States should, as Kissinger has also said, and Lyndon LaRouche calls them Tweedledum and Tweedledummer, because they tend to have slightly different takes on the same geopolitical outlook for the British, that we should be friendly and involve China and bring them into the World Trade Organization, something which a lot of rational people in China don't think should be done because it will help destroy their economy. They look around at South Asia and they say, this was no big help to have your economy open in this way. But on the other side, as long as that friendship is arranged in such a way as to be a conflict with Russia, this is perfectly fine. So he'll run into a whole variety of ways of trying to either contain as well as confront China. But we understand him to be extremely humorous and capable and knowledgeable of American history, as you find many of these current crop of Chinese post-Mao leaders are, who are looking at trying to develop their country finally. They've studied Franklin Delano Roosevelt and what he's done. They have looked at the peaceful technologies, and they're trying to get the best out of the West. After all, Sun Yat-sen the founder of the Republic of China, was a total devotee of Abraham Lincoln, and was created as a Republican, Christian Republican in fact, by the networks which Lincoln had sent around the globe to promote railroads and joint economic development, very similar to that of the Eurasian Land Bridge, which Mr. LaRouche is promoting today.
So can you say more about LaRouche's New Bretton Woods proposal? I know we've featured it on shows all the time. But.
Right. Well, LaRouche's proposal has called for a conference between sovereign nations that would effectively reorganize the monetary system, eliminate free trade in currencies, and establish a basis for long-term credit issuance between nations based on a development perspective. It doesn't work without, it doesn't work simply as currency controls, which we should go back to, like the old Bretton Woods, and everyone should agree on that perspective. It doesn't work just on debt reorganization, although in this conference a lot of debt is going to have to be shelved, particularly speculative debt, but also sovereign debt, as in the case of Russia, where there's unpayable and unconscionable debts. But then a development perspective, particularly around developing the heartland of the planet, Eurasian Land Bridge, totally in the interests of the United States, as well as every other major nation and minor nation of the world.
So it combines what worked in the old Bretton Woods Agreement with what's been otherwise called as a just New World Economic Order, which features development of developing countries, or combined development of developing and developed countries.
Right. The problem that has tended to happen in recent years is people say you have to take down one section of the world economy to build up another. Not so. The entire capability of the advanced sector has to go together with nations like China and Russia to build up this center. And that's the hope, that President Clinton will reestablish the basis for this strategic partnership and see that as the alternative to war, a way to peace.
You've been listening to EIR Talks.